Thanks very much. Are there any fathers in this room? There are. Well, I've got bad news and good news for you. If you read The Guardian this morning, it says, being a dad makes less of a man. It says the hormones that define the male of the species slumps dramatically when men become fathers, researchers have found. Men who devote at least 3 hours a day to childcare have even less testosterone, suggesting that looking after dependent children helps suppress the hormone. So that's the bad news. The good news is that it gives us perfect excuse not to spend very much time with our children so that we can become real men again. I think this kind of stuff that you see in The Guardian, which is not a tabloid newspaper, on a fairly regular basis indicates just how normal the discourse of expert advice in relation to family life has become. And one of the things I've been doing the last few years is to try to move away from parenting as such and look at the way in which parental authority and adult authority works in relation to other forms of authority, particularly expert authority, over a long period of time. In my own work, I begin in ancient Greece, and as a historical sociologist, I try to sort of look at the different dynamics that occur in relation to the differential distribution of authority. And I suppose the main point I want to make, if you fall asleep in the next 20 minutes and don't wake up, if there's one point that I like to kind of bring out, is that the most important change that has occurred over a long period of historical time is that expertise today in relation to parenting gives answers to questions that parents haven't asked yet. Like I never asked what being a good dad was all about in relation to my testosterones, but now that's been answered. And similarly, I received a pamphlet the other day about how I should touch my child as a father. It wasn't a question I asked anybody. I never felt the need to learn how to touch a child. I figured by the time you get to my age, you kind of have a certain grasp of these kinds of issues. But what experts now do is not simply tell you how to bring up a perfect child, how to make sure that your child becomes Einstein, how to make sure that your child is very healthy. They really discover all kinds of problems you never fantasized about. I mean, they just, the most improbable issues become part of the child-rearing agenda in the 21st century. And I think that's one important difference in the way that this whole thing has evolved. And in many respects, in my own work, what I try to do is to kind of look at the process of what Max Weber called the process of rationalization, where, in a sense, taken for granted ways of doing things are gradually displaced by formalization of everyday life, the way they kind of replaced by the juridification of everyday life, the introduction of legal norms, but also by the introduction of expert science. Expert knowledge becomes increasingly important, and in a sense, implicitly is in a competitive relationship with the kind of knowledge that you and I gain, tacit knowledge or taken for granted knowledge that we gain through our everyday experience. And that competition can also be seen as a competition of authority. I mean, who do we trust? Who has an authority to make certain kind of pronouncements? Whose judgment? The mothers, the fathers, or Dr. Spock's is the one that really matters. And it seems to me that one of the consequences of the otherwise perfectly good revolt against tradition and traditional morality, which is great, I'm all for that, is that at a certain point, all forms of authority come under scrutiny and question. And indeed, by the time we get to the late 19th, early 20th century, authority is increasingly associated with abuse, the abuse of authority. Authority is almost ipso facto seen as authoritarian, the opposite of freedom. That's the way it's generally perceived. And under those circumstances, what also begins to be challenged bit by bit is also what I call adult authority, which is a very important way in which generational dynamic occurs in the interaction between adults and children. Adult authority becomes demoted, and of course, parental authority becomes gradually stigmatized. And this point was very, very clearly made by Hannah Arendt, who was referred to earlier on in her discussion of this question, because what Hannah Arendt does is she looks at the way in which different political forms of authority sort of become compromised, becomes diminished over a period of time. And then she introduces what I think is a very valuable concept, a little bit opposite to what you were saying, the idea of pre-political authority. And pre-political authority for her is like the authority of the elder, the authority of the ancients, the authority of the parent, adult authority. And she makes the point that something phenomenally interesting begins to occur in the whole emergence of modernity. And she says a crisis occurs where authority, in a sense, becomes continually kind of contested. And the way she explains it is this. She says the most significant symptom of the crisis, indicating its depth and seriousness, is that it has spread to such pre-political areas as child-rearing and education, where authority, in the widest sense, has always been accepted as a natural necessity, obviously required as much by natural needs, the helplessness of a child, as by political necessity. The continuity of established civilization, which can be assured only if those who are newcomers by birth are guided through a pre-established world into which they are born as strangers. And Hannah Arendt introduces this very interesting concept of natality, which I think is very rich in terms of understanding the whole idea of parenting, where, in a sense, we understand that although we think of our world as just individual parents with individual children, what we are, in a sense, whether we like it or not, are part of a generation, part of a group, a cohort of adults who are there not just to kind of waste time and to kind of look how beautiful we are. You know, whether we're parents or not ourselves, whether we're fathers or mothers ourselves, our job is to bring this new generation into the world through a kind of authoritative, interactive dynamic. And what Hannah Arendt argues is that's what begins to become challenged and eroded. And in particular, it begins to get eroded by the introduction of expertise, where expert knowledge gradually begins to displace the kind of wisdom of the elder, the experience of older people, and the intuitive grasp of how you do things that most fathers and mothers somehow manage to kind of work out for themselves. And I think that to me seems to be a really kind of important development. Now, it seems to me what we find is that from the 19th century onwards, parental competence is continually challenged. I mean, if you look at, for example, Mills, his argument for introducing education, a system of education in England, is because he doesn't believe that parents can cultivate, sort of their children in the right kind of way. And although in the 19th century, most of the parents who are targeted by professionals and by experts are the working class and the poorer section of society, what's incredibly interesting is that with the passing of time, every parent becomes targeted, and every parent is assumed to have a deficit in their capacity to kind of bring children up. So the net kind of widens throughout the 20th century in relation to that. And I think what experts also begin to do, and in that sense, it's a very interesting expertise. It's not like other kinds of expertises that you have in the scientific domain, is that experts very self-consciously try to both bypass parental authority and to directly stigmatize it. So that poster we saw earlier on, that Janet kind of showed us, where you have the grandmother being sort of denounced for being so stupid that she doesn't realize how important it is to give vegetables to children. That argument is very, very common. It basically says, don't listen to your grandparents. That was the argument. Do not listen to your grandparents. They live in a different world. They're thick, especially if they're immigrant. They don't know, sort of what the British way or the American way of life is. Now that argument, do not listen to your grandparents, has been extended to don't even listen to your own parents. I mean, children are now told in a number of different circumstances that your parents are really uncool. They're not able to do the right thing. So, I had my son come back from school with little leaflets that are meant to be lecturing me about recycling more, because parents are not environmentally conscious, not like their children. And you have time and time again, the usage of children by experts mobilizing their opinion, that so-called pester power, as a way of morally teaching us, older folk, about the right things to do. So that kind of demoting adult authority, demoting parental authority, bypassing it, becomes increasingly important. And what's very interesting is that this is an expertise that gradually merges into an all-encompassing one. So when Jana was talking about earlier on, she made a very clear and good distinction between experts that just simply comment and those that actually give us advice. Well, the interesting thing is that at a certain point, the facts gradually merge into the normative. This is what you ought to do. This is not just disinterested information. This is what you ought to do. And the normative becomes increasingly more and more prescriptive, right? And that's what we have today, a more kind of prescriptive element, where in a sense, expert advice is no longer about, hey, this is an interesting view, here's a couple of interesting ideas, take it or leave it. At a certain point, this is what you have to do. And it's not even something that you have to do in a kind of voluntary sense. This is something that government agencies are there to back up, because they're there to tell you what is, what a responsible parent does. So in that sense, what we have is an interesting development. And the other thing that changes is complexity. I mean, as you know, expertise has always traveled well by claiming that this problem is more complex than you imagined. My own field of sociology in the 19th century evolved by telling the world that what you thought was actually fairly straightforward, dare I say even black and white, so far too complex. If you ever go to a sociology seminar, just write down the number of times they talk about complexity, and this is and ambiguity and nuances and all the rest of this. Everything is phenomenally complex. And as you go down the world, as you come to the 21st century, you'll find that complexity becomes ever so more complex. So that even domains of child rearing experience that you thought could be left to people like you and me, such as cuddling a child, you now get government pamphlets that tell fathers how to hold their child, just in case, this act has escaped you. You've never seen a cuddling occur ever before. So complexity occurs and becomes more and more entrenched. And I think what happens, and this is what has happened in the last 20, 30 years, certainly since the 1990s, at a certain point, and I think this is the most damaging dimension of expertise, the experts gain control of intergenerational conversation, the kind of things that Hannah Arendt was talking about, the importance of intergenerational contact. I was doing a radio interview early on and debating with a parenting expert, and I made the point that I would rather, as a father of my son, I would rather be the one that talks to my son about sex. I know the guy, I know a teeny bit about sex. If not, I can read a book or whatever. I would rather that I talk to him about it than you did, who doesn't know my son, doesn't know anything about it. And the guy says, I could just hear, I couldn't see him because we were in a different radio station. The guy kind of looked at me in my kind of fantasy, as if this guy must be from a different planet. How could a parent ever imagine that they can have a normal conversation with such a complex problem, such a highly specialized problem as sex? How could that accomplishment be ever imagined? And I think what you've got here is this idea that the really important discussions between generations, the ones that really matter, not about sort of what did you do in school today, but the ones that really matter are best left to the professionals. They are far better intermediaries of these kinds of conversations than parents are. So what happens increasingly is that experts gain control of intergenerational relationship, and that becomes really quite important. From an expert point of view, responsible parenting is help-seeking parenting. I mean, when you talk to sort of parenting experts, they have a language of their own, and they think that parents that seek their help are responsible, and therefore, because they seek help, and defer to the expert, are behaving responsibly. And they even have a name for parents that are not help-seeking parents. We call them in England, I don't know what's the case in America or elsewhere, hard-to-reach parents. Have you ever heard that? Hard-to-reach parents. They're the ones that are not interested in sort of advice. And in fact, even when you bombard them with their advice, they kind of tune off and look somewhere else. And because they're hard to reach, they kind of, sort of not really susceptible to the kind of communication you send to them. They're by definition irresponsible. They're at-risk parents. They're the kind of parents that sure start schemes and other kind of schemes, you really need to kind of target very, very carefully. I want to end up with a paradox, a contradiction. And the contradiction that I'm very interested in at the moment to explore, maybe others can talk about it as well. I noticed that one of the papers deals with this tangentially, is this. From the point of view of contemporary parenting discussions, we assign to the parent enormously incredible powers. I mean, they're omnipotent. I mean, parental omnipotence is virtually institutionalized. Parental determinism is really the Bible of parenting in contemporary society. Everything that your child accomplishes is due to your parenting skills. Everything that your child fails to do, whether in school or in relationships, in the domain of mental health or later on in life, is really your fault as a mother and a father. It's a very clear causal relationship that's been established, and that is really, there has to be like that, because if there isn't that causal relationship, then virtually everything that experts tell us wouldn't really kind of work, because you'd have to introduce other variables, other kind of factors into it. So on the one hand, you have parental omnipotence, and that's something that scares us as mothers and fathers all the time. But alongside parental omnipotence, you also have experts claiming to know what should be done. It almost seems to be a kind of paradox that on the one hand you have parents who can change everything about their child for the better or for the worse, but then you also have experts who want to have the last word, who basically kind of are there to tell you that in this complicated world of child rearing, we're the ones that need to be consulted. And I think that this kind of relationship is a paradox, because actually what they are really saying is not that parents are omnipotent. What they're also saying is that parents are extremely feeble and unreliable and unlikely to achieve results. And it seems to me that the way that this paradox works itself out is that parental omnipotence is culturally sanctioned and is culturally affirmed so long as parental omnipotence is mediated through the expert. In other words, that's the current situation, what I find particularly interesting, worthy of exploring, that we live in a world where the omnipotence of the mother and the father is exercised through the medium of the expert, which then leads us back to the previous contributions, what you call first-person perspective. Because what the parenting experts do in the manipulation of parental omnipotence is actually tell us that it's through the script that they give us. It's a script that they kind of provide for us, through their third-person perspective, that you will be able to begin to play the role allocated to you from the point of view of this sort of parental omnipotent model. And I think it's that kind of balance that we need to analyze and understand, because in a sense it's got both this deceptive element where we tell ourselves that everything that we do really, really matters, but at the end of the day we're also told that nothing that we do actually matters unless it is mediated through the expert advice of professionals. Thank you.